Hey guys, I thought I would have a bit of a ramble about semiconductors and sort of why I hold what I hold and sort of why I've got rid of one or two recently and sort of am considering consolidating a little bit more. This sort of pyramid gives you a little bit of an idea into sort of the industry. You've got sort of the foundries obviously at the top, TSMC and Samsung. Intel sort of would also be in there as well, but they count them as a integrated design manufacturer, I think that is. And then you've got SMIC, which is the Chinese trying to sort of grow their way into the industry, and then sort of Global Foundries and UMC sort of do, not to put it harshly, but less important stuff. They're never really sort of competing for the big business that TSMC and Samsung do. And then you have basically the customers of the foundries. This obviously isn't all of them, but your Apples, AMDs, Qualcomm, Broadcom, ARM, not really a customer as such. They sort of design a lot of the chips, Nvidia, and yeah, lots of others. So these companies sort of basically have the expertise to design their own chips, but have sort of very little interest in actually manufacturing them themselves. So they outsource that to the sort of foundry companies. AMD used to manufacture their own chips, and they sort of weren't very profitable at it. Didn't really have the money to sort of keep up with Intel, basically, who do manufacture their own chips. So they outsourced it to TSMC and spun off, I believe, Global Foundries sort of as a separate business, and they're sort of now doing okay on their own, sort of doing the, as I say, less leading edge chips, we'll call it, and AMD sort of pushing on with their own designs and outsourcing them basically all to TSMC. And you've also got one or two companies that do manufacture their own chips in sort of Micron and SK Hynix on the sort of memory side. I do hold Micron at the moment and sort of weighing up really whether they're better value than people like TSMC, to be honest. I sort of did get rid of Samsung on the basis that they're not entirely semiconductors, and I was only really interested in the semiconductor side. Not too bothered about the sort of phone side, and certainly not consumer electronics. So I did drop Samsung. If they were ever to spin it off and it was sort of a reasonable valuation, then I would probably be straight back to them, but not as it is. And yeah, the memory sector is sort of a little bit more commodity, sort of really down to price. Micron do have sort of some advantages over the others, but sort of Samsung being the largest, it's just not 100% sure if I want to stay in that side of things. So I am considering switching Micron for TSMC, depending on sort of price, maybe. If sort of Micron holds up well, maybe get a little bit of a pullback on TSMC because it has rocketed up. And then sort of layer down, you have the sort of equipment and sort of testing manufacturers. So ASML sort of basically make the machines inside the foundries. So not all that many customers, I suppose, but TSMC, Samsung, they'll also supply Micron, SK, and yeah, basically they're pretty much the only ones who make the machine that makes the chips. And then, yeah, you've got various other sort of companies that manufacture materials for it. KLA sort of do the testing, I believe, and Lam sort of make the actual wafers that semiconductors come out of. And yeah, other sort of companies that sort of supply the more granular, sort of smaller scale materials. And yeah, then you go into sort of software and that sort of thing. Obviously, there's hundreds of software companies. That's only a small selection. And they've got this link over here to sort of other customers, sort of basically all fabless. And you've got sort of Tesla designing their own chips. There was sort of talk of them manufacturing, but they don't seem too interested at the moment. Google sort of designing their own chips, and Facebook, people like that and Amazon sort of for now are seeming to be sort of either buying Intel or AMD chips, but are sort of interested in designing their own. But can't really expect any of these to ever be interested in manufacturing themselves. So chances are they'll all be coming over to TSMC and Samsung, and Intel sort of want to be a player in that industry. They've got their foundry services. So I did sort of have a brief look at Intel's results in the Saturday video, and they do have Intel foundry services. I think they're sort of building in the US as sort of partly a initiative to sort of bring chip making back home from Taiwan. Obviously, TSMC are moving into other countries as well, sort of considered safer countries. Japan, certainly big in the US, potentially Europe as well. And Samsung are doing the same. So there's no guarantee that sort of Intel are going to get too much business just for being in America. And obviously the foundry services is a very small part of their revenue at the moment, but is up 30%, 14% on the yearly. Whereas sort of the rest of the business is largely down. The bigger sections of that business, Mobileye up, but that's sort of something that I presume they want to get rid of long term. So yeah, Intel sort of struggling a little, and I guess this is partly down to this lot basically switching from Intel to AMD. Sort of look at the market share charts of the sort of enterprise chips. It's just continuously going in favour of AMD. They're only up to about, I think I saw 30% market share of server chips, but from what I understand, it sort of takes these big companies quite a long time. Obviously, if you've got data centers with thousands, tens of thousands of chips, then you don't sort of swap one out and swap one in an afternoon. It can take 18 months or even a year at sort of best case scenario to switch. So they're now switching to AMD, and I guess Intel have got to sort of catch up basically, and then potentially wait 18 months or a year best case scenario to get these customers back. So really you've got to be looking at sort of 2025, I would have thought, until that potentially starts reversing. From what I understand, I may be wrong in that, but that seems to be the way it's going at the moment. TSMC's sort of revenue is still on the up, where Intel's sort of is down. So AMD doing well. I can only assume this isn't a total semiconductor downturn. It's more just Intel not doing quite as well. Just looking at the sort of top 10 foundries, so you can see how big a position TSMC have. Third quarter 2022, $20 billion in revenue. Samsung is second at 5.5, and then sort of UMC and Global Foundries sort of trailing behind. And as I say, this isn't really leading edge nodes, as they call it, sort of the advanced chips. Then you have the Chinese, and yeah, various other sort of smaller players. So it's really TSMC way out on top, and sort of even during I guess third quarter 2022 wasn't really the start of things slowing up, but yeah, they're still up 11%, where Samsung were sort of flat, ever so slightly negative. The two sort of smaller guys sort of increased slightly. UMC pretty much flat, and the Chinese flat, interestingly, although it's only one quarter one quarter to the next. Not sure what that's like on the yearly. I haven't had a look, but it's less than a tenth of what TSMC are doing. I expect they're going to be a big player because China wants to grow their semiconductor industry and not be reliant on Taiwan. And I expect they don't want to be buying US manufactured chips, even if it is still TSMC. But yeah, that sort of gives you an idea of dominance basically at the moment. TSMC went from 53% market share to 56% in just one quarter. And yeah, that is dominant, over half. I thought this was a nice little sort of high-level view of TSMC's top 10 clients. Interesting sort of honourable mention at 11th place, not on the list, is Intel. They're sort of needing to catch up, I guess, and decided to farm out some of their manufacturing to TSMC because they're struggling to sort of get down to 3 nanometer and 2 nanometer chips. So yeah, they come in at 11th. But yeah, top 10 sort of top company, you have Apple, I believe about just over 25% still. So they're a huge customer. Basically make all of the chips for every phone, every tablet. And now they've switched from, sort of in the last couple of years, they've switched from Intel CPUs in the laptops and the desktop PCs to their own chip. So they've designed their own chip, and so this is Apple Silicon Labs. And yeah, again, being a fabless, not the slightest bit interested in making it themselves. They just design it and ship it off to TSMC. So it's Intel's loss and TSMC's gain. And so yeah, that's become 25% now, and I guess potentially would only grow as they sort of, I guess, compared to last year, previous years, more people are now buying the sort of Apple Silicon Max. Then that's going to increase, so they could be getting to 26-27% maybe. MediaTek was an interesting one. Sort of the, I guess, basically cheaper phones CPU manufacturer. So a lot of sort of the top end phones that aren't Apple will use Qualcomm chips, but you find sort of a lot of the cheaper phones and a lot of the sort of Chinese manufacturers and sort of other Asian manufacturers will end up using a MediaTek chip. So they were sort of doing the lower end, but they're now getting into sort of higher end chips that compete directly with Qualcomm. I can't imagine you're going to start seeing them certainly not in a Samsung anytime soon, but sort of the bigger manufacturers maybe aren't going to switch to them, but it's certainly what they'd like to do. And obviously even on the lower end, it's still huge amount of volume. There's a lot of interest in $200 phones, $100 phones even. So yeah, MediaTek is number 2. Number 3, AMD. As I say, switched basically all of their manufacturing to TSMC and are now sort of basically way ahead of Intel on the CPU side for consumers and sort of getting into the server side as well. So AMD basically only predicted to grow as a TSMC customer. Qualcomm is an interesting one. They sort of, as I say, they do the higher end and some mid-range sort of phone chips, and they sort of go between TSMC and Samsung, sort of depending on who's competitive, who's got the best chips at the time. And it looks like very recently they did go to Samsung sort of a year or two ago, and they're now potentially coming back to TSMC. It does say this is sort of, TSMC potentially making the Snapdragon 888. You got Broadcom, which is sort of quite a bit linked to Apple as well. They use TSMC for their chips. Not exactly the most advanced chips, but yeah, it's sort of a big customer. But so I've got Broadcom. I do hold them quite a large position, but a sort of risk with them is that they're a big supplier to Apple, and Apple are considering sort of making their own versions of the Broadcom chip that they use. So that's potentially taking quite a bit of business away from Broadcom, and yeah, Broadcom are sort of diversifying as much as they can, buying sort of other companies and trying to attract other clients for them. If Apple do end up sort of designing their own chip in sort of instead of using the Broadcom one, sort of you can pretty much guess where it's going to end up. It's still going to be at TSMC as well. So it's a loss for Broadcom, but it isn't most likely a loss for TSMC. So I just find that sort of safer potential, really. I mean, there's nothing to stop Apple going to Samsung, I guess, for it, or potentially even making friends with Intel again. They've sort of had a very troubled past and don't appear to be wanting to use Intel, but if they're manufactured in the US and sort of Intel get their fabs up and running and they're competitive, there is potential that Apple could have Intel make these chips, or maybe even start making the Apple silicon chips and the phone chips, but just not sure I can see it anytime soon. So I'm guessing a loss for Broadcom would still just mean that TSMC keep it. They just change from Broadcom to Apple. So that's good, but sort of a slight ding on Broadcom. Nvidia, similar to Qualcomm, really, sort of switch between Samsung and TSMC, depending on sort of who's competitive. 2021, they switched from Samsung 8nm to TSMC's 7nm for the new GeForce chips, and sort of reading that they use TSMC for the A100, which is sort of the data center and I believe sort of the automotive chip, which is sort of their largest growing industry, really. They're sort of having a bit of a rough time of it with consumer sort of GPUs and even the data center, really. So data center is sort of pretty flat, which is why I'm currently short Nvidia. But yeah, good to see them sort of using TSMC for the growing side of the business. You've got Sony. I didn't really realise were sort of quite as big. I think they're about 2.5% of TSMC's revenue, so that's quite good. They're also TSMC building a $7 billion chip facility in Japan, and Sony are putting 500 million investment into that facility. So I guess they're taking a part owner. And yeah, they use TSMC for the image sensor division. Wasn't sure entirely what they would use them for, but yeah, I guess they need advanced chips for the image sensor side. So that's pretty good. And then finally, sort of a couple of smaller people, Marvel, STM, and ADI. These are only sort of 1% or so of revenue, but always good to have other smaller customers. They could grow potentially in the future. So yeah, that's sort of a rundown of their top 10 customers. I thought was quite interesting. As I mentioned earlier, there is potential new, fairly large customers coming in. Tesla's full self-driving chip. They were sort of been designing themselves, and there was talks that they would be potentially building a fab to manufacture these themselves, not wanting to sort of outsource it. But yeah, the latest rumours certainly is that they're going to use TSMC for it. So the hardware for computer is the one that sort of looks like it's coming over to TSMC. It's interesting, their history. They used to use an NVIDIA chip, I guess in the sort of something like the A100 chip, which would have been sort of manufactured by either TSMC or Samsung. Then they switched to a Samsung designed chip, and they're now, I guess, designing their own chip and getting TSMC direct to manufacture it. So for now, at least, they may want to sort of build a fab and make it themselves in the future, but it looks like sort of going forward, they're going to be a fairly large customer of TSMC. And Google as a potential customer as well. They're sort of, we're looking to get away from using Qualcomm, I believe, on their phones, and sort of started designing their own chip, which is good. So that would be potentially using, I believe they were using Samsung, potential to switch to TSMC in the future. But yeah, whether they're using sort of Samsung or TSMC is all good. And they've developed a video coding unit chip, I believe, to use in their data centers. It's sort of being dubbed the YouTube chip, and yeah, it looks like that would be sort of again a Samsung or a TSMC chip, which is good, and it's sort of leading the way really in this sort of trend of the big tech companies designing their own chips and sort of wanting to get away from just using a stock chip off the shelf from AMD or Intel. Obviously, you can use their chips, and if you need more power, you're just basically brute forcing it and getting more power out of it. But yeah, I kind of think it's sort of in their interest to design their own chip if they can. You can design them with sort of a relatively small team. Google obviously, have like 120,000 employees. You can sort of dedicate 100, say, to developing your own chip, and then sort of farm it out to the foundries direct, rather than sort of, as you say, just using an Intel or AMD chip and just sort of brute force buying a bigger, more expensive chip if you need more power. They may be able to sort of design it more efficiently themselves and use less power, say, or sort of more efficient power, and save money that way. And then what may have been an Intel chip is now either a Samsung or TSMC customer, unless Intel can really ramp up that foundry side and sort of supply those chips as a foundry. I appreciate there is a potential loss of business for TSMC if these customers were using an AMD chip, which would be made by TSMC, and they could switch to their own design chip that could then be manufactured by Samsung. So that would be a loss to TSMC. But yeah, I think there's plenty to go around between the two going forward with all of these customers and many, many more. I didn't really mention the sort of Department of Defense and people like that. US military budget is always pretty huge, and I guess they would want manufactured in America if they can. So they're probably very keen for TSMC and Samsung to be building the US fabs. But yeah, that was sort of really my thoughts on the industry and sort of potentially switching my Micron holding for more TSMC. Basically on this idea that, all of these companies are really not interested in making their own chips, and yeah, TSMC sort of and Samsung being a more specialist competition really than the memory side. As I say, you can have advantages in memory design, but really it's largely comes down to price. So Micron versus SK Hynix versus Samsung and sort of one or two others, it's just a race to the bottom really. And at similar valuations, certainly on a sort of forward PE basis, they're all sort of quite similar, Intel, Micron and TSMC, and even AMD, to be honest. But yeah, that's potentially where I'm at. So yeah, leave your thoughts in comments below. If you hold, I guess quite a few of you hold at least one or two of these. So, yeah, drop us a comment and like and subscribe. See you soon.